Hello, good evening, and welcome to this event dedicated to conversations around a better future for people and planet. My name is Stephen Watson. I'm the founder of Stack, which is a service that searches out the best independent magazines and delivers them to thousands of people around the world every month. We have a subscription service which sends out surprise magazines, or we also have a shop where people can just go and buy magazines. And all of this puts us at the heart of a very exciting independent magazine industry. And we're going to be hearing from 3 of those magazines this evening. So Where the Leaves Fall is a magazine based here in London. Icarus Complex, also here in London, and Emergence is over in California. And the thing that unites them all is that they are interested in conversations around nature and climate change and the ways that that is changing the world. But importantly, each of them tells their stories in a very unique and particular way. This evening, we've struck upon a theme of exploring borders. So we're going to be seeing 3 different stories, all about people and things crossing borders, looking at journeys that have been motivated or affected by climate change, and asking what does it mean for a world to be shaped by these paths and these journeys that are being made. So Where the Leaves Fall is going to start off for us, and they're looking back to their first issue and revisiting a story about illegal logging in the Amazon, and basically bringing that up to date and kind of showing what has been happening since the magazine came out, because obviously one of the things that print magazines are not very good at is staying up to date with things. So we'll go back and look at that. Icarus Complex is going to take a more structural approach. So it's looking at what environmental migration actually is. And so they're going to present an interview with somebody from the United Nations International Organization for Migration. So defining environmental migration and asking how does it affect people's lives in a very real way. And then finally, Emergence is going to be looking to the future for us, looking ahead to an upcoming project that they're going to be working on over the next year or 2 years, looking to map and understand human and non-human migration. I think it's worth noting that this evening has come about as a collaboration between these 3 small independent magazines, and as all independent magazine makers do, they spend a huge amount of time crafting the actual physical thing that you hold in your hands to read that magazine. But this has really come about as an attempt to try to find other ways of engaging with people in a meaningful way, and particularly in this kind of live digital environments. This is a first for them. And I think I'm right in saying that this is also a bit of an experiment, a pilot. So I'm hoping that this is going to be the first of many events that we'll see independent magazines coming together to talk about the things that they do. So a little bit of housekeeping just before we get started. I'm going to introduce each of the magazines and they'll speak for around 15 minutes or so each. We will have questions at the end, and we're going to be running the Q&A through the Q&A box in Zoom. So if you have questions that occur to you while you're watching the presentations, please just mouse down to the bottom of your screen. You'll see the Q&A box in there. Just add your questions to that. You can also upvote other questions that you see in there that you like. So keep an eye on that box, and we'll be looking at that at the end when we're putting questions to the panel. It's worth noting that this event is being recorded and we'll release the video from this in the next few days. No, nobody will be seen. we won't be able to see you in the video, but obviously if you ask a question, use your name. We may well use your name. So just to let you know, that's out there. I think that is everything that I said that I was going to say before the proper talking began. So it's probably time for me to hand over to our first magazine and introduce David Reeve and Luciani Pisani, the editors and art director of Where the Leaves Fall.
Thanks for the introduction, Steve. Yeah, we are the editors of Where the Leaves Fall magazine. It's a quarterly print and soon to be online magazine exploring humankind's connection with nature. It's created in conversation with On Bed Gardens. We've just put out the 6th issue of the magazine, but as Steve mentioned earlier, what we're doing now is revisiting a story that's in the 1st issue.
Yeah, where we can, we like to revisit some of the past articles, and this one is very relevant and it's very important at the moment. In the 1st issue, we explored the theme of boundaries, and one of our articles was about the Uru Ewawau people, and we featured the work and the words of the photographer of Gabriel Ushida. I think Gabriel is in best position to introduce himself, but we just want to say that we really appreciate that he made it today, because we know that the situation in Brazil, it's really difficult and it's getting worse. So thank you, Gabriel, for being here today.
Hey, hello everyone. First of all, thank you very much for this invitation. Nowadays, mostly because we are living under almost under military dictatorship in Brazil, I try to be very low profile, not be on camera or show my face or my name. But this invitation came from very special people, marvelous magazines that I admire and respect so much. So here I am. I would like to introduce myself, but also show a few slides that I prepared to show my work, because, you know, I'm a photographer. So I'll share my screen. I think it's working. So this is me as a kid. I'm from Brazil. I'm based in the Amazon since 2016. One of my favorite artists in the world is movie maker Alejandro Jodorowsky, and recently, he was about to present a new work of him, and he said that the best way to talk about it, the most sincere and honest way, was recording himself naked, because he was the most open and sincere way to talk about it. I know it's almost nighttime in London, but I will spare you guys from seeing my naked body. But this is almost the same. It's me as a kid. And the more I walk and travel here in the Amazon, the more I see myself as a kid. Just a small little body who needs to learn more and more. And my mind is always open to learn since I'm here in this whole new world. So I first came to the Amazon in 2016. I was living abroad for a while. My family is originally from São Paulo, but I have already lived in several places like Germany, Argentina, Cuba, the US a little bit. So when I first came here, my first trip to indigenous land was a proper nightmare, really a nightmare. I visited this place called Pacas Novos Indigenous Territory, which is in the border with Bolivia. It's in between Bolivia and Brazil. It's one of the main routes to cocaine drug dealers. And then the way to this place was around 4 hours driving in a path that looked like there was an airstrike there and a mix of mud. It was a pretty bad road. Thousands of potholes, and then after that we still had to get a small boat. It was like around 6 meter aluminum small boat We had to use it for hours, and all of a sudden it was raining. And in a few minutes, we were in the middle of a thunderstorm with lots of lightnings around. And we were this small group in the middle of this thunderstorm, and it was raining so bad that the water drops, they felt like needles hurting you in the face. And our bodies and our backpacks, they were so wet that it was also super cold. So it was a proper nightmare. And once we got in the village, it was already dark. So we didn't have much water. We had to drink water from the river. I couldn't sleep that night because there were so many mosquitoes, animals, and I also had diarrhea because of the water. Of course, I wasn't prepared to drink that water. So it was a complete disaster. Like that was my my welcoming card to the Amazon. But the next day, when I kind of woke up, I started seeing everything that was around, which was marvelous and great and amazing. So I was in the middle of this small indigenous community in the Amazon, far away from everything. And this particular place, there were around 500 people living there. Lots and lots of kids. They didn't speak Portuguese. They only they speak indigenous language called Chapacura. But they were super excited to communicate, to get to know new people. And there were this bunch of kids playing around and coming to help. And then, like, when people ask me about how is it to live in the Amazon or how is it to live with indigenous peoples, I say that it's magic, tragic, and very intense, because that's how it is. You know, besides the first bad trip that I had, the bad first day, there was a lot of kind of suffering. Besides that, the whole thing was amazing. I could learn so many new things, and I realized I was in a completely different world, and I was like learning from just different perspectives, and it was amazing to see, like, to be presented to this new universe, to this new cosmos that I haven't heard about. Because I imagine that you guys from Europe or London or whatever, you guys don't know much about the Amazon. But honestly, not even Brazilians know much about it. For example, before coming here for the first time, I haven't been here, and nobody knows much about the indigenous peoples in the Amazon, not even Brazilian people. So it was super intense since the beginning. Before coming here, I used to work as a photojournalist. So I was already in Africa, a bunch of countries, more than 20 countries, Africa, Europe, America, conflict zones. And most of my stories, they were related to conflict and violence. And I remember before coming to the Amazon, I was preparing myself to go to the battlefield in Ukraine, to the front lines. But then I decided to come back to Brazil. And this is a photo of terrorist attack in Turkey against the Kurdish people. I think it was like the ISIS against the Kurdish people. And then, like, when I was living in Buenos Aires for a while, and then I was preparing myself to move back to Europe to go to this conflict zone in Ukraine, because I was, as a young photographer, I was excited about war, conflicts, and stuff. But then a friend of mine said, "Hey, but we have so many conflicts in Brazil right now, especially in the Amazon. We don't say it's a war, but it's kind of a war. You should take a look." So I gave up this previous issues, the subjects and issues that I was working before, and I realized that it was even worse here, honestly. And one of the first things that happened to me is that when I was my first trips, my apartment was invaded, and it was pretty recent. So I haven't had time to organize my stuff yet. So everything I had was stolen. Not everything, because I was traveling, but like most of my cameras, computers, and hard drives, they were all stolen. So I lost everything I had from before. So it was kind of a way to delete my past and to start and to have a brand new start. So everything I had from the past, all my previous works, they were like vanished, they were deleted, and I had to start again. And it was amazing that it happened in the Amazon, because the more I was learning about it, the more I was understanding that was the place that should be. I'm showing you this recent report from the United Nations saying that indigenous and tribal peoples are the best guardians of the forests of Latin American Caribbean, and that's it. Because now I'm going to talk more about climate change and environmental issues. We know the Amazon for this huge land of huge and rich land, green forests and jungle and stuff, but we don't know much about indigenous peoples, and we don't know that they are actually living here since centuries and protecting this land. and being with these peoples is amazing to understand and to see to see new perspectives of the world. So I was so lucky to meet Chief Omir Surui when I first got here. Chief Omir Surui is one of the most important indigenous leaders in Brazil. He's the smartest and sharpest man I know. He's super visionary. And his people, their first contact with the non-indigenous society was in 1969, which is pretty recent. He was born 5 years after his parents found the white man. So imagine that his world is under lots of transformations in a short period of time. Even though Omir is a very smart person who understands the Western world and the outside world so well. And since when I came here, he took me as his son and started teaching me about his points of view and how to think new ways to keep living in this planet. So he talks about a lot about deforestation, climate change, and progress and development. Because in Brazil, historically, the Brazilian government said they were trying to develop the Amazon and to colonize the Amazon. Historically, we have several mistakes. First of all, Brazil was not. They say that the Portuguese people, they discovered Brazil a few centuries ago, but actually they invaded Brazil. And then a few centuries later, the Brazilian government started like colonizing the Amazon, which is also not true, because there were already millions of people living in the Amazon. And the Brazilian government also says that they want to bring, till nowadays, they say that they want to bring development to the Amazon. It's also not true, because this idea of development that they have is just basically destruction and cattle fields and soy fields. So I'm sorry. It brings me to this topic that climate emergence. Like a lot of people talk nowadays. A lot of people talk about climate change. I'm happy that the world has decided to listen to young leaders like the Swedish girl Greta and some activists talk about climate change. But we're actually living in a climate emergency, because the way we live nowadays, the way we're treating the planet. Is definitely not good. We can think and read stories from 200 years ago, or like stories older than that. But honestly, if nowadays we stop and think how it's going to be our planet in the future in 200 years, I'm not very optimistic about it. The way if we keep treating the planet the way we're doing it now. It's pretty hard to imagine like our human being here in 200 years. So it's really sorry, it's really an emergency. A very interesting author, that a Brazilian indigenous leader who writes a lot about it, is this guy Ailton Krenak. Luckily, recently he had his first book translated to English, so you can find it. Ideas to Postpone the End of the World. He talks a lot about that. I'm sorry. And he criticizes this crazy idea of pursuing new planets and pursuing new territories. Once we already have we already have the Earth, and we're basically destroying it. Then he understands capitalism not as an entity, but a phenomenon that affects everything, and we're just destroying the whole thing. So for me, it was so amazing to understand the indigenous peoples, that their cultures and their story, it was created and developed not having like the profit or exploitation as a goal or as a main object. Their cultures, they are organized following new goals, following different aspects of life. And so one example of that is the Fordland. Fordland is a city created in the Amazon in 1927 by the famous businessman Henry Ford. He wanted to create a city here in the Amazon in order to produce rubber for his company. What happened is that he came here to the Amazon, and he basically he didn't care about what was going on here. So he basically brought his ideas without knowing what was here before, and he tried to introduce completely different ideas to this place. And Fordland was a complete disaster. It started in 1927. It was ready at 1930, and in 15 years later, it was destroyed. Because since the beginning, he wanted to introduce completely different cultures to the local peoples and to the environment. So, sorry. He introduced the assembly line to the rubber trees, but it happens that the rubber trees, they used it to live like spread in the forest. So once they are run next to each other, once one gets sick, all of them will get sick. So he introduced the assembly line to these rubber tree fields, and it was a mess because all of these trees died. Because he didn't want to understand how life was here, how the Amazon was. He just wanted to introduce his way of thinking, and it was a complete disaster. And this is just one example of how the history goes here. Besides Fordland, like being very didactic, deforestation, illegal logging, land grabbing, meat industry, it's all related here. Like in a very didactic way, this is how it happens. Like, first of all, people go to an area, they cut down the most valuable trees. Of course, these areas, they're main indigenous territories, so they cut down the most valuable trees. Once they have what they wanted to, other groups, they start land grabbing. And at a certain point, they will basically destroy everything and start cattle fields. So they will basically destroy whole environment, like huge areas of richness. For example, and it was in 1848, yeah, that two British naturalists, their name are Henry Walter Bates and Alfred Russel Wallace, they wrote that they were in the Amazon, and just by walking around a city for 1 hour, they could find around 700 species of butterflies. At that same time, in the British Islands, there were less than 100 species, and in the whole Europe, there were only around 300 species of butterflies. But at the same time, they could find 700 species of butterfly in 1 hour in the Amazon. So this area is so rich, is so amazing, is so gorgeous. But the way we, unfortunately, are using this territory is just to create cattle fields, just to create like soy fields. We're basically vanishing all the life, all the knowledge, all the culture that we have here. So what should we do in order to prevent that, or in order to maybe to postpone the end of the world? I think my suggestion is to listen to the forest and to all this ancestral knowledge that there is in the forest, and to empower local communities. This is a photo of the Uruê-Wauau indigenous people. They are less than 200 guys, and they live isolated in the forest. Their first contact with the white man was in 1981, so it's really, really recent. And their territory is around the size of Israel. And they have hundreds and hundreds of invaders every single day. And they have their own organized groups to protect it, because the Brazilian government doesn't want to protect it. And actually, especially nowadays, they're much more interested on destroying this land. For example, nowadays we have this example in the north of Brazil, the Yanomami people. They're being attacked by illegal miners. Nowadays, there are around 20,000 illegal miners there, and even mafia mobs are going there to attack these indigenous peoples to pursue gold that is in this land. So this is the current situation in Brazil, and the Amazon is one of the worst places for journalists or activists or land defender in the world nowadays. I can tell you that for sure. I've been around the world, but here, especially now under this new presidency, that it's pretty similar to a military dictatorship. Everything is pretty hard, but especially for the land defenders and the indigenous peoples who keep this ancestral knowledge and who are defending this forest. And it's important to notice that the Amazon it's not a bunch of trees for Brazil or for 9 different countries. What happens here influences the whole world, because we are in one planet, and this huge area of forests it influences the whole world. So what happens here is somehow connected to the UK or to Europe. So it's important to understand what's going on and to prevent, and to especially to think of new ways to think the future. And I don't know how's my time, but to finish my part, I'll show you a very short video, and there's a silent part that tells and feels much about how is it. This is a invaded area in the Amazon, and I filmed a illegal logger cutting down trees, and it was crazy because he didn't care about me being there. He knew I'm a journalist, and they're so empowered by the government right now that they really don't care about showing their crimes. So this is what happens. This silence is killer, and the silence, this lack of life, tells much more and can show you guys much more than I probably could. So thank you guys very much, and I appreciate the invitation and your time. And I'll go back to our colleagues from the other magazines.
Gabriel, thank you so much. That was really powerful and kind of depressing. I've got to say, it's really, really interesting. I'm going to introduce our next speakers in just a minute. I just want to remind you first, while you're watching this, please do keep in mind any questions that you might want to ask our panelists and use the Q&A box for that. So I'd like to hand over now to Afsaneh Rafi, the editor-in-chief of Icarus Complex.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Steve mentioned, I'm the editor of Icarus Complex, a magazine that aims to take an in-depth look at the issues and solutions surrounding climate change. Here's the latest issue. I'm really thrilled to welcome Emma Bryce and Mariam Traoré-Chazal-Noël as our guests tonight. Emma is an amazing journalist who has written about climate change and migration for Icarus Complex. In our first issue, she documented what it means for people to have to give up their homes because of flooding or rising sea levels from Bangladesh to Wales to Louisiana. And in our latest issue, which will be out in a couple of weeks, she explored what the effect of drying and warming lakes around the world has had on local populations and how that has often led to the disintegration of the social fabric of communities in those areas. Along the way, she's been able to turn to Mariam Traoré-Chazal-Noël as the senior expert in migration, environment, and climate change at the United Nations Migration Agency, the IOM, for her knowledge and insight on the subject. Mariam will help us understand the complexities of trying to define what exactly environmental migration is. So thank you both for being here tonight, and I'll hand over to Emma and Mariam.
Hi there. Thank you, Afsaneh, for introducing us. It's really great to be here. And thank you also, Gabrielle, for your really eye-opening presentation. And thank you for joining us, Mariam. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you again. I, as Afsaneh mentioned a couple of minutes ago, came to Mariam with one of my stories that I wrote for Icarus Complex most recently about lakes and drying and migration associated with that phenomenon. And Mariam was really, really helpful in helping me to understand just the complexities surrounding what climate migration is, what it actually looks like on the ground. And I think that, you know, as a journalist trying to navigate the complexity of this issue, part of that was also trying to appreciate just how difficult it is not only to define environmental migration, but also how to quantify it. So we see these huge numbers flying around, and Mariam, you and I have talked about this before. Some saying 250 million people will be displaced by 2050. I read earlier today an article saying that more people were internally displaced by climate-related disasters in 2020 than by war. So I think that those numbers can be really difficult to grasp, and even in some way quite unreliable, just because the impact of climate change on humans by its nature is so difficult to define. And so speaking to that, I'm finally getting to my first question. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about why that is so challenging to define, why this phenomenon is so hard to define, and how that's connected to the many drivers associated with climate migration and the several forms that this phenomenon can take.
Sure, thank you, Emma. Such a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. So, yes, you are very correct. It is extremely hard to understand the scope and the scale of what we are calling here environmental migration. First of all, it's hard to define what it is. There are different ways to refer to this phenomenon. Here we're using environmental migration. Some other people will talk about climate migration, disaster displaced people, even climate refugees. Bottom line is that there is no internationally agreed definition of who are the people who are migrating in connection to climate and environmental impacts. And in the absence of a definition that is acceptable by all, then it's really hard to know who to even take into account when you're trying to determine how many people are moving. The numbers that you just talked about, they're all correct to an extent. They just refer to maybe different dimensions. So for instance, the data that says that there are more people internally displaced by disasters, by conflict. This is a finding that has been pretty much acknowledged scientifically for the last 10, 15 years. So it is very true, but it's only one part of the issue, because what we are forgetting here is that climate change has impacts on so many different levels. There are some impacts that we can see immediately, like when there's a disaster, or like in the first presentation, we are seeing like immediately how the communities are suffering. But there are also impacts which are less immediate. So especially those that relates to sustaining livelihoods or maybe health impacts. So there are a number of people. We think that these people are very numerous, probably millions of people who are moving because of climate impacts on their livelihood. So basically, anyone who's working in primary sector like agriculture, fisheries, and so on, who finds their professional opportunities curtailed because maybe there are less rain variability, makes it impossible to have the same to get as much out of crops as before. So anyway, all of these factors on their ability to have a living also push people to migrate, but most of the time you will see these people as economic migrants rather than climate migrants. So all that to say, to conclude, that there are many ways that you can, there are many people who can be environmental or climate migrants depending on the definition that you're looking at. I would just like to highlight that it's not just those who are immediately moving because of a storm or who are caught in flash floods, but there are many other people who are indirectly affected by climate change and who are moving because of this. And if we are looking at the future, this is probably one of our major policy issues coming up.
Mm-hmm. And just relating to that, how has the complexity that you've just described, how has that actually shaped our international response so far? So what's the kind of the lay of the policy landscape?
Mm-hmm.
And a kind of a crucial question nestled within that is whether climate migrants, people affected by environmental change, are recognized currently in international or national law?
So the complexity that we just described, obviously it has impacts. So the first impact that I've seen, because I've been working on this question for a while now, it took a while for policymakers, whether they were the global policymakers involved in like United Nations type of negotiations, or whether they are policymakers at the national level. In any case, it took a while for people to make connections between all of its different factors, because there was a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding. But I feel that in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, there's really been a lot more awareness. And to me, this is linked to several things, but something that really changed is also the media response. Now, I mean, if I look through my media accounts on a daily basis, I'll see some information shared publicly on the impacts of climate change on migration, displacement, and so on. But this is fairly recent. If you Google archive from like 10 years ago, this was really not a topic that had a lot of visibility. So what I find is that the public awareness is higher. Therefore, this also influences the awareness of policymakers. So they have a sense that something needs to be done. You see some advance more at the principal level. Within the United Nations, there are a number of agreements that have been negotiated among states. These agreements are non-binding, but they still represent a kind of moral path to follow. And they are interesting in that sense, that they are giving countries tips on how to provide protection to people moving in connection to climate change. And maybe just to say very quickly what these kind of things are, because I think those are very practical. And it's interesting when you're thinking, if you're facing someone who is moving because of climate change, what can you do for them? Well, one of the things obviously that you can be working, the level you can be working at, it's anything related to visas, providing specific kind of permit to live in other countries, or even in other parts of some countries for which you need permission to move around. So there's really the question of giving legal status to people who are migrating because of climate impacts, so that they have a minimum of protection. They are not illegal migrant, and they can access basic services.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. And, you know, this whole event that we're having now is kind of broadly focused on borders and our relationship with them in a changing world. And what you've just described is sort of the idea of taking some proactive measures potentially to account for how migration will look in the future because of environmental change. Something I'm really interested in is whether you see in your work and in your research examples of countries that are currently taking these proactive steps now and basically kind of reimagining what it looks like to move and what borders look like, and taking a more proactive approach to human movement. Are there any kind of great examples of countries that are setting a primer for other nations on how to tackle this challenge?
Yes, so there are a number of countries which are really thinking about this issue. So the vast majority of them are not at the stage where they have like changed their immigration laws and so on. But for instance, you do see some specific schemes, like in East Africa, a protocol for free movement of people has been adopted recently, and amongst the reasons given that allow people to go from one country to another in the east of Africa is the people impacted by disasters and climate change. So I think we are going to see more and more of that. Even here, I'm based in New York right now, so maybe just to talk a bit about the US, if you're looking at the at an executive order that Joe Biden released early in February, it is related to climate change. And in that is basically requesting his administration to make some proposals on how to handle this cross-border climate migration issue. It's not really specified who the migrants are, but I'm assuming it's mostly people who would be coming from South America. So this, at the moment, is so basically the American administration is working on developing some kind of recommendation. They approached us, my organization, to help them. So eventually all of this will somehow, I hope, turn into some kind of changes that will somehow be officialized. It always takes time, but I think what we're seeing right now is at least the willingness of some countries, whether they are developing countries or whether they are wealthier countries like the US, to at least think of doing something. And now we have to see if this will be done in practice, but at least there is openness to consider the issue.
Yeah, I think the complexity you're describing sort of at the policy, national and international level is also interesting because it has other manifestations in terms of how we talk about climate migration and environmental change and people moving. And I think about that quite a lot as a journalist. And I think that it's important to consider how journalists and storytellers capture the nuance of what climate migration is, what it looks like on the ground, the different forms it can take. And understandably, the majority of coverage we've seen so far, you were sort of touching on this earlier, has focused on the associated challenges of migration. We always use language like that, the challenge of migration, you know, the difficulty of it. But it also feels like there's been this gradual shift away from that specific narrative, maybe towards something a little more positive, looking at the potential of environmental migration in the future. And I'm really curious to hear from you what you envision as sort of the more positive aspect of environmentally driven migration. Do you see it could be a positive force, and what sort of shape would that take in a future world?
No, yes, absolutely. And this is really one of the points that we are trying as an organization, as a UN organization, to come across. Obviously, we are not trying to minimize at all the challenges. They are real. We are talking about millions of people who could be in extremely difficult situation where they are threatened, even physically threatened by the impact of climate change. So this is not to say that this doesn't exist. But I think the key is also to remember that migration throughout human history has brought benefits to societies of origin, but also to societies of destination. You know, like if you look at the history of the US, obviously it wouldn't be the great country that it is now without all of this migration. During the pandemic, again, who were the workers who really kept our economies going? Migrants. So I think we do need to remember that. And I think there is more of an understanding that indeed people who are migrating because of climate impacts or other reasons, they can have great value in society, specifically in terms of climate and migration. But what we're also starting to notice is that people who have migrated from, let's say, some West African countries or maybe the Marshall Islands to Hawaii, they have a really strong interest in supporting their communities where their families, their friends are still living in their places of origin. So they have a really emotional interest to support actions for climate adaptation, climate resilience, and they can really play a role in that, whether it's with financial support or more educational activities. So I think looking at the future, if we are talking about climate action in areas vulnerable to climate change, then one way to really get people on board would also be to include these migrants, these diasporas who are living abroad and who are very willing to contribute and help.
So a final question for you kind of is related to that, Mariam, which is that from the position of someone with such in-depth knowledge about this issue and a lot of experience researching this on the ground as well, what is something you see in your work that people get wrong all the time about climate migration when we talk about it, when we think about it? And what would you like to see that replaced with? How would you rather we speak about it and think about it?
So I'll be fast because I know we need to close. So I think for me, the main misconception is people not seeing that many things are connected. Like, for instance, conflict in some region can be connected to difficulties to access natural resources, which are diminishing because of climate impacts. So basically, a lot of the time, I'm seeing people who think, oh, people are just moving because of disasters, and we need to just give them some humanitarian help so that they can, I don't know, rebuild their houses and so on. But there is much more to it. So I guess my message is think of the complexity, think of the impacts on economic conditions, livelihoods, even health, because that's also something, impacts of climate change on health that push people to migrate. And it's only then that you can really look at all the different dimensions. So I thank you very much. I know that we have taken enough time. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mariam. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Back to you, Steve.
And I am very, very sorry for having to hurry people along when they're talking about such interesting stuff. But we have even more interesting stuff to come. So I'm now going to hand over for our final section to Emmanuel Vaughan-Lee, who is the executive editor of Emergence Magazine.
Hello, Steve. Hello, everybody else on the panel and who are tuning in from around the world. Such a pleasure to be with you. My name is Emmanuel Vaughan-Lee. I'm the founder and executive editor of Emergence Magazine. We are an online and print publication exploring the threads connecting ecology, culture, and spirituality. We publish an annual print edition and then publish new content weekly, exploring a range of themes and topics, but all of them are trying to find these threads that connect our environmental crisis, our ecological crisis, and our cultural crisis with this perhaps broader, deeper void, which one could describe as a spiritual crisis, a crisis of connection. It's really been interesting listening to these presentations from our fellow publications, hearing from Gabrielle, very, very moving and important work that you're doing, and from Miriam and Emma, the complexity of this question of migration. We as a publication are, always trying to think about the underlying causes of where we have landed as a global culture in our relationship to the living world and the complex environmental, social, political, economic crisis that we're dealing with that are just so intense and multi-layered, and that we need to perhaps, whenever we can, reveal the layers of complexity to the core crisis that might be at the heart of what we're dealing with, this crisis of connection with the living world, with how we relate to the natural world and the incredible relationships that have supported us for millennia that come from the living world rather than just the human world. And that there is perhaps a crisis of story at the heart of this. For millennia, cultures around the world always had at their core a relationship with the living world in some shape or form that one might call sacred, and that their cultures were built upon this. And as Gabriel described in his presentation, indigenous people have held on to that connection longer than most, as modernity has shifted our relationship from the living world to one of kin and relationship to one of resource. And so that is kind of the editorial ethos and frame that underlines all our work at Emergence. And this topic of this discussion here today of borders, expanding borders and boundaries and migration is one that we are tackling editorially over the coming year or two. It is, of course, a story which has shaped humanity's experience. For the beginning and dawn of our time here on this planet, we've always migrated and shifted as we've wanted to explore our own horizons as a species and also respond to the crises that have been unfolding as part of that story, whether that be fueled by environmental issues, droughts in a region, a depletion of resources, wars. We've always traveled and migrated as a species, as part of our story, as part of our collective story. But never before have there been so many causes that have been pushing us to reconsider our relationship to place and force us to perhaps abandon homelands and think about the viability of staying in the space that our families and cultures have existed for millennia, that perhaps in decades to come will no longer be viable places to call home. So this is a really big, complex issue that we are tackling. And one of the ways we want to approach it is by giving voice not just to the human perspective of this experience, which is, of course, so important, but also the non-human perspective of this experience, which we feel often doesn't get enough attention. The impacts that our patterns of behavior as a culture are causing, not only to fellow humans, but also to the non-human world, is hard to quantify and hard to take in at times. And their voices need to be included in this story, even though we are telling them through a human lens. Even by giving them weight and validity, we feel it can help shift that underlying story of disconnection that lies at the heart of the current crisis we're dealing with. So finding stories and finding ways of telling stories that include the non-human stories of migration, which we'll be sharing just in a couple of minutes, one of the pieces that we're working on about trees and tree migration. But thinking about how a place, a landscape, a species has existed somewhere for millennia, and humans' relationship to that place has existed for millennia, and then is suddenly upended because of the tremendous crisis we're dealing with, has huge implications for the relationships that exist in that place. As you'll be hearing in a couple of minutes from Chelsea, she'll be talking about, one of our staff writers, Chelsea Steinauer-Scudder, will be talking about trees and the relationships that have existed in places and the people who inhabit those places for millennia. What happens when those trees start to migrate because of a changing climate? Another story that we're working on, I just referenced it today because these publications are that we're sharing the space with today are based in the UK, and we have an interview coming up with a wonderful folk singer from Britain named Sam Lee, who's famous for singing with nightingales, and we're publishing it in a couple of weeks. And he was sharing with me how, perhaps in 30 years, the nightingale may not sing anymore in England. This is a migratory bird who makes its way from Southern Africa all the way up to England each spring to sing. And there are so many aspects of English society and culture which are built on the fabric of that relationship of the nightingale song embedded in folk songs and stories and memories. And what happens when that nightingale no longer sings? And what happens to the memories and the relationships when they're no longer an ongoing experience. These are the kind of stories we're interested in exploring and telling at Emergence, that weave the human and the non-human together and ask the questions about what can exist in the future when the human voice takes over the non-human voice in the landscape that we're heading towards. So my pleasure to introduce my colleague Chelsea Steinauer-Scudder, who is going to talk about trees in the northeast of the United States, in Maine, where she lives. And I hand it over to Chelsea, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Emmanuel, and thank you, Steve, and all of the panelists. What an incredibly rich conversation this has been. I'm so grateful to be a part of it. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. So, as Emmanuel mentioned, we are in the process of working on this story about tree migration, taking a non-human view of what border crossing and migration can look like. And I wanted to say that I think as storytellers, sort of before we assemble what we've heard and learned and sort of share a final product, part of what we're asked to do is really step back and listen. And Gabrielle said this as well, that, listening to the forest, listening to the wisdom of the people who are there. And so we come in with questions. And for me, one of the most exciting parts of storytelling is how those questions shift and evolve throughout the process. So I'm going to weave some of that into my presentation today, since that is the place I'm at in this story right now. So when we think of non-human migration, we might think of monarch butterflies or humpback whales or Arctic terns or coho salmon, beings that take their cues from changes in the season and the amount of sunlight and travel thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of miles to feed and to give rise to the next generation. And then when we combine the terms climate change and migration, we might then think about how changing ocean temperatures or extreme weather patterns are disrupting some of the patterns for these animals and their food sources. And these are really startling and unsettling, painful changes that in many ways are being seen in real time. But what about beings that migrate more slowly? What does it look like when a forest moves? So this is going to be a long-form multimedia piece exploring migration from the perspective of and on the timescale of trees. And what migration means in this context for these species that cannot physically walk or fly or swim, species that are rooted in place, is that of course older trees stay put and often tend to weather change quite well, but the regional establishment of younger trees shifts as the surrounding conditions change. So sprouts begin to trend in a certain direction that is more suitable for growth and survival. And so the forests begin to creep. And from a human perspective, especially for humans like me who are not studying these changes in a long-term way, that change can be so slow as to be almost imperceptible in our lifetimes. But critically, in tree time or in forest time, many of these changes are actually happening far too quickly for species to be able to keep up and adapt. So across the United States and around the world, forests are generally moving north and west. And of course, they're taking complex ecosystems with them. So this piece is going to focus on 3 native tree species in the state of Maine, where I live: sugar maple, black ash, and red spruce, which are moving in some cases slowly and in some cases more quickly as they shift their range. And I wanted to look at trees that were specifically in relationship with some of the people who live among them. And I wanted to consider these questions. How do we define the borders of a forest? What are these trees taking with them as they move? What is arriving in their wake? What is the relationship between the trees' migration and the ecological systems and human communities that they are leaving behind? In a symbolic sense, what does the movement of these beings reflect back to us in the present and foreshadow for the future? What is at stake when our home landscapes change around us? How does this alter our sense of place? And how do we bear witness or bid farewell? So for the sake of time today, I'm going to focus just on the black ash tree. Black ash ranges across the northern United States and into Canada. They typically grow in bogs and along streams and prefer humid climates with cold winters. And their seeds are an important source of food for birds and small animals, and their twigs and leaves for deer and moose. And importantly, the black ash has porous wood that allows its layers of xylem to be easily separated along growth rings. And that particular trait has created a very special bond between the black ash and the indigenous people of Maine. And in fact, indigenous people throughout the range of the black ash tree who have traditionally used this tree in basket making. So in Maine, the Wabanaki people are made up of 4 tribal groups: the Micmac, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, and the Penobscot. The black ash tree is part of the Wabanaki creation story, and within these communities, there is an ancient and ongoing tradition of ash basket weaving. And one of the people I'm speaking to for this story is a man named Richard Siliboy, who is a Micmac elder and a traditional ash basket weaver. Richard grew up in Aroostook County in northern Maine. And when he was a child, this was the potato capital of the world, with 250,000 acres of potatoes grown every year, all of which were harvested by manual labor. And each and every laborer had a potato basket, which you see here, made primarily from ash trees. And Richard's mother made and sold these baskets, and with the help of Richard and his siblings, the family would go into the woods to harvest black ash trees, pound it to create splints, and weave upwards of 140 potato baskets every week, which they would sell for 50 cents each. And as Richard grew into an adult, at a certain point, he realized that fewer and fewer in his community knew how to make these baskets. Now at 75, Richard makes his living through basket making, but it's also how he's working to preserve and pass on the Micmac culture and basket making tradition. So how is climate change affecting the ash tree in Maine? As often happens when you dive deeply into a subject that you know just a little about going in, you realize that you go in with assumptions and that many of these assumptions are incorrect. So I think as Miriam and Emma spoke about with human migration, it's also very difficult to define exactly how climate change is affecting trees and forests. The present day forests in Maine are the result of a complex set of environmental and historical factors and present day factors, including the fact that Maine, one of Maine's biggest industries is the timber industry. So 60% of Maine's forested land is managed by commercial timber companies. Climate change predictions in Maine include increased drought in some places, increased rainfall in others, increased temperature everywhere, changes in the pH of the soil, and the introduction of pests and invasive plants, and the possibility of increases in wildfires. I've spoken to several forest ecologists who are conducting studies that have already been going on in some cases for decades to monitor the effect of these changes in forests. And even with these long-term studies, it's difficult to predict what's going to happen. So agriculture and timber and ongoing development and forestry are really shaping the forests in Maine today. So back to the black ash tree. The emerald ash borer was first observed in the United States in Detroit, Michigan in 2002, likely having arrived on cargo ships. The larva of the emerald ash borer feeds on the inner bark of ash trees, disrupting the tree's ability to transport water and nutrients and resulting in tree death in nearly 100% of cases where the borer is present. So in the last 2 decades, hundreds of millions of black ash trees have been lost as the borer moves east across the United States. And warming winters are speeding up this movement. So in 2018, the borer was found in Aroostook County, where Richard now lives and harvests his ash trees. So when we look at the confluence of factors affecting the range and movement of black ash, we see that the emerald ash borer is poised to devastate the black ash tree population in Maine. Warming temperatures and increasing drought were already affecting the trees, and now are making it easier for this insect to move more quickly. And in other states where millions of trees have been lost, and can be assumed to also be the case in Maine, the forest that was lost also lost much of its ability to store carbon. So it feeds right back into the cycle of increasing climate change. And that raises a whole new set of questions. How will this composition, how will the loss of ash trees change the composition of forests and the complex ecosystems that make them up? What does the disappearance of the ash tree mean for people like Richard? What does it mean for the Micmac way of life? What does it mean if Maine loses the black ash tree for birds, for deer and moose? And how do we tell that story? What parts of that story can we tell? In many ways, it's a multi-generational story. It's both happening now in our lifetimes and happening on a scale much beyond any individual scope of understanding. And of course, we're part of the story too. So considering migration is a way of asking, as the world shifts around us, what are the stories that we can tell, and who are the human and non-human voices that we need to listen to? Thank you so much.
Chelsea, thank you so much. Again, that was another totally fascinating perspective on this same subject. We've just had a message come through. Unfortunately, there's another webinar which is waiting to start, which needs to use the same Zoom as this. So I'm afraid we're not going to have chance for the questions after all. But I just want to say thank you very much to everyone for watching this. Maybe everyone should switch their videos back on and just come back really quickly, just to say, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much all for sharing your stories. It's been genuinely fascinating. And I really hope that this can be something that happens again.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you all.